Cowboy came searching for milk. Apache woman breastfed the baby and became the mother he needed. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Dawson Reddick rode with his shoulders hunched against the wind, the cold cutting through his coat as he kept the infant tight against his chest, holding the small body as if steady pressure alone could keep him alive. Late autumn had taken the color out of the land around Copper Ridge. The grass stood dry and sharp. The sky hung low with a gray that promised early winter, and every breath he took felt cold enough to scrape the inside of his throat. He had been riding 3 days with barely more than a few hours of broken rest, and the strain showed in the dark circles under his eyes and the stiff way he held himself in the saddle. But he kept moving because stopping meant the baby in his arms would not survive the night. Dawson's past had already taken too much from him, and he carried that knowledge in the slow, careful way he spoke and moved. Years earlier, he had lost his younger brother during a raid gone wrong, and afterward he had drifted across the frontier with no aim but to stay alive and keep out of trouble. He avoided towns unless he needed supplies, kept to open land, and rarely spoke to anyone unless forced. But when he found the overturned wagon 3 nights ago, its canvas ripped, wheels split, 2 bodies lying motionless nearby, something changed in him the moment he heard a weak cry coming from beneath the broken frame. He had crouched down, lifted the cloth, and found a 4-month-old baby half wrapped in a torn blanket, mouth dry, eyes unfocused, skin cold. There had been no hesitation. He had taken the child, fed him melted snow and the weakest broth he could make, and kept riding, hoping to stumble across someone who knew how to save an infant on the edge of starvation. That was why he was here now, approaching an old trading post he had once passed years before. He had seen a faint trail of smoke from the ridge that morning and followed it, hoping someone lived inside. His mission was simple: keep the child alive. Nothing else mattered. He dismounted in front of the structure, boots hitting the frozen dirt with a dull thud. The building leaned slightly, boards dried and cracked, roof patched with old hides that flapped loosely in the wind. His chest tightened when the baby let out a thin, strained cry, barely strong enough to be heard over the wind. Dawson brushed a hand over the blanket. "Hold on," he murmured, voice low, controlled, but edged with fear he couldn't hide from himself. He pushed the crooked door open, the hinges protesting with a long, slow creak. Cold air followed him inside, mixing with the faint smell of old smoke and dust. For a moment, he thought the place was truly abandoned, empty and long forgotten. Then he saw movement, subtle, quiet, near the back wall, where a small line of light slipped through a gap in the roof. Nima stood slowly, rising from a worn blanket on the floor, her form outlined by the thin beam of daylight. Her long black hair hung past her shoulders, part braided, part loose and tangled from wind. Her deerskin dress, once well-made, now bore tears along the neckline and sides, revealing warm skin, curved hips, and faint scratches on her legs from weeks of hard travel. She looked like someone who had been surviving with limited food and no real rest, but there was steadiness in the way she held herself, a kind of strength formed after too many losses. She had been hiding here for nearly 2 months, recovering from the death of her husband and newborn child, who had both been killed during a conflict between settlers and a small Apache band. After burying them, she walked north with no clear destination, avoiding towns, avoiding both white men and Apache men, staying alive because she didn't know what else to do. She chose the trading post because it kept the wind off and gave her a place where no one came looking. Her main mission was survival, quiet, hidden, uncomplicated survival. When Dawson stepped inside, her eyes went immediately to the bundle in his arms. She read the situation fast. The child was sick, starving, fading. She didn't blink. She didn't startle. She studied him with the alert caution of someone who had seen danger arrive in many shapes. Dawson tightened his grip slightly, steadying the infant. "He won't last another night," he said. His voice was deeper than he intended, rough from days without water and hours without speaking. He wasn't a man who asked for help easily. Even now, He felt a strange pressure in his chest, a mix of embarrassment, desperation, and fear. But he stood firm because the child's life depended on this moment. Nima took 2 slow steps toward him. Her expression did not change, but her breathing shifted slightly, the kind of shift that came from recognition and pain layered together. She reached out, palm up, waiting for him to give her the baby. Dawson hesitated, not because he didn't trust her, but because the act of handing over the child stirred a sudden spike of fear inside him. Fear that he might lose the only living thing that had depended on him in years. But he forced his fingers to unclench. She could help. He couldn't. He placed the baby into her arms with careful precision, his hands lingering half a second longer than needed. Nima held the infant with practiced familiarity. Her thumb brushed along his cheek, feeling the coolness of his skin and the limpness of his limbs. Her breath tightened. "He is starving," she said quietly, her tone steady but edged with something personal. Dawson swallowed hard. "I tried everything I could," he said, his voice thin, almost defensive. He can't swallow enough." Nima shifted the baby slightly, adjusting her grip so the child rested against the warm skin exposed by the torn neckline of her dress. Dawson looked away quickly and then forced himself to look back when he realized his reaction felt sudden and clumsy. He wasn't sure whether he was flustered or worried he was being disrespectful. Maybe it was both. "He needs milk," Nima said, examining the child's weak attempts to nuzzle toward her chest. "Real milk, not broth." Dawson's stomach dropped. For a moment, he felt useless, like he had carried the child all this way only to realize he didn't know enough to keep him alive. "I don't have anything," he said quietly. "Not that." Nima drew in a breath that caught slightly at the top, her eyes flicking down to the child and then to the ground. "My body." She paused, steadying her voice. "It still remembers. Not much, but enough. I can try." Dawson's chest tightened again, but this time with relief that left him faintly dizzy. He watched her carefully, not staring, but watching, because this moment mattered more than anything. Nima lowered herself to sit near the cold hearth, shifted her torn dress gently, and guided the baby to her breast. The child latched weakly at first, then with growing strength that lifted a tiny sound from him, something between a cry and a gasp. Dawson let out a breath, so long and so quiet he barely noticed he had been holding it. His vision blurred for half a second before he forced it steady. He wasn't crying, not truly, but the relief cut sharp. Nima kept her eyes on the infant, steadying him with small movements. Dawson looked at her hands, the careful, confident way she supported the baby's head, and then he looked at her face. Her eyes carried grief, exhaustion, and something like determination. He realized she knew exactly what she was doing, not just physically, but emotionally. She was allowing herself to feel something she had feared she'd lost forever. After a while, she said, "You should eat something. You look ready to fall." Her voice was soft but direct. He shook his head. "I'm fine." "You're not," she replied simply, not looking up. He didn't argue further. When the baby finally relaxed against her chest, breathing steadier, she lifted her gaze and studied Dawson more closely. He looked worn down, eyes hollowed by worry, body tense from days of riding. But he also stood anchored, as if leaving now was not an option. "You can stay here tonight," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a practical decision. Dawson scanned the cabin, the broken boards, the gaps in the roof, the cold air sneaking through the doorframe. Then he looked at her and the infant in her arms. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We'll stay." He stepped inside fully, closing the door behind him. The wind pressed against the wood, but the room felt warmer now, not because of fire, but because someone here finally knew what to do. Dawson leaned against the wall, keeping his eyes on the child's chest, rising and falling with new strength. For the first time in days, he allowed a small, cautious hope to form in the back of his mind. The trading post was broken, the land was cold, and he had no plan beyond tomorrow morning. But Nima was here, the baby was alive, and for the moment, the three of them shared the same breath of shelter. It was not safety, not yet, but it was enough to start with. The cabin settled into a heavy quiet once the wind eased off the door, and Dawson lowered himself beside the wall, close enough to watch Nima and the infant, but far enough to give her space. The dim light coming through the broken roof touched her face as she shifted the baby to her other arm, making sure he stayed latched. His breaths came steadier now, each small rise of his chest easing a bit of tension from Dawson's shoulders. He hadn't realized until this moment how tightly fear had been wound inside him. A few minutes passed before Nima finally spoke again. "Tell me what happened," she said, her voice low but steady. "People will want to know where the wagon was, who attacked it. There may be others out there." Dawson nodded, realizing she was right. Listeners would wonder too, how he found the baby, whether danger was still nearby, and why he hadn't taken the child to the nearest town. He cleared his throat, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. "I came across the wagon near the pass. Looked like it had been hit 2 days before I found it. Maybe 3. He swallowed, thinking of the bodies lying stiff and cold. Family headed west. A man-woman. Supplies scattered. Shot marks on the boards. Whoever did it was in a hurry." He paused, remembering the tracks he'd seen. For horses, heavy boots, no sign of the raiders staying long. Could have been bandits. Could have been drifters. Too many types out here willing to kill for a rifle or a saddle. Nima's jaw tightened slightly. "You saw no footprints heading north or west?" "No," he said. "Just a baby into the wagon. Maybe they hid him there. Maybe they thought he was already gone." The infant's small hand curled weakly against the neckline of her torn dress. Nima brushed her thumb across his cheek, her voice softening. "He was meant to be found." Dawson didn't respond, but he felt the weight of those words settle deep. He had asked himself the same thing during each mile of the ride. Why he didn't walk away, why the baby cried only when he was losing strength, why Dawson hadn't been able to leave him behind even though it made no practical sense. Maybe it wasn't about sense. Maybe it was about the part of him that still knew how to care. When the baby finally drifted into a milk-heavy sleep, Nima lifted him gently and wrapped him tighter in the cloth Dawson had used earlier. "He needs warmth," she murmured, "and rest. So do you." Dawson pushed his palms into the floorboards and stood, joints stiff. "Roof's got holes everywhere. Wind'll cut through here all night. That is why I sleep against the hearth," she said, nodding toward the stone fire pit, even though no flame burned now. "The stones hold heat longer than the air." Dawson glanced at the cold ash. "I'll get fire going." He stepped outside before she could object. The wind bit at his face, but he welcomed the cold because it woke him up and let him think. He gathered dry wood from beneath the collapsed lean-to, checked his surroundings twice out of habit, and scanned the tree line for any sign that someone else had been watching this place. Nothing shifted. No tracks besides his own and a few old ones that belonged to Nima. When he returned inside, Nima was adjusting the baby's blanket. Dawson knelt at the hearth and struck sparks until a thin flame took hold, catching on the driest pieces. Warmth spread slowly across the cabin. Not much, but enough. "You traveled alone this long?" Dawson asked, keeping his eyes on the fire. "Yes." Her tone held no self-pity. "There were places I avoided. Places I tested from a distance. I stopped here because no one came for weeks." She studied him as she spoke, as if deciding whether he was safe enough to trust with more than simple facts. "I only needed quiet. Nothing else." Dawson nodded once. Quiet was a language he understood. He added another log and let the crackle fill the silence. "If you want, we can move the bed closer to the fire. Keep the baby warm." "I have no bed," she corrected. "Just blankets." Her gaze shifted to him. "But tonight we make room." Something in her expression softened. Not flirtation, not boldness, just a calm acceptance that they now shared responsibility for a fragile life. Dawson reached for the blankets folded near her spot. "I'll help." Nima didn't stop him. Together they laid the blankets near the hearth, making a space large enough for the baby and a spot beside him. When Dawson placed the cloth-wrapped child down, the baby stirred, made a thin sound, then relaxed into the warmth. "You saved him," Nima said quietly. "No," Dawson answered just as softly. "You did." Their eyes met in the firelight, a brief, steady connection that held more truth than either of them had said aloud. Dawson felt something shift inside him. Respect, gratitude, and something more complicated that he didn't want to name yet. He finally sat back, rubbing his hand over the stubble on his jaw. Once he's strong enough, I'll have to find town. Someone with a doctor, maybe. Someone who might know who he belonged to. Nima's fingers paused over the baby's blanket. And until then, Dawson hesitated, then said what he already knew was true. Until then, I'm not going anywhere. This time Nima did not look away. Her breathing slowed, almost relieved. Good, she said simply. He will need both of us. The fire warmed the room. The wind softened outside, and the baby slept between them, his breath steady and full. For the first time since the raided wagon, Dawson felt the night settle around them without the sharp edge of fear. There was still danger in the world beyond the cabin. Raiders, cold, hunger, the unknown. But inside this broken trading post, the three of them were alive, together, and finding steady ground. The chapter closed on the sound of the baby's quiet breathing and the steady crackle of the fire as Dawson and Nima sat facing it, both too tired to speak but too aware of each other to look away. Morning came slow, the kind of pale gray light that slipped in through the cracks in the roof and stretched across the cabin floor without warmth. Dawson woke first. His back ached from sleeping against the wall, and his legs felt stiff from days on the trail, but he forced himself upright with a quiet breath, scanning the room the way a man does out of habit. Nima was still asleep near the hearth, one arm curled protectively around the baby, her long hair spilling across the blanket. The infant lay against her chest, breathing deep, fuller than last night. His small face relaxed in a way Dawson hadn't seen since he found him. For a moment, Dawson didn't move. He just watched them, saw how naturally Nima held the child, saw how the fire's last embers glowed faintly against her skin, saw that the baby's color had improved. Relief settled into him in a solid, almost physical way. But with it came new questions, ones any listener would have asked by now. Who would come looking for the baby? What if the raiders returned to finish what they started? And how long could they stay hidden in a half-broken cabin with no supplies? Dawson pushed to his feet, careful not to make noise. He stepped outside, the cold hitting him hard enough to pull his breath short. Frost covered the ground, and the horizon stretched empty in every direction. He crouched, checking for footprints, fresh ones, unfamiliar ones. The land was clean. Only his tracks remained. He went to the lean-to, grabbed his knife and a small coil of rope, and started toward the tree line. If he didn't hunt today, they wouldn't have anything by nightfall. But he couldn't shake the thought of leaving them alone in the cabin. Something inside him tightened at the idea of Nima waking to danger with only a sleeping baby in her arms. When he returned a moment later to gather the last of his gear, he found Nima awake, sitting upright with the infant nestled against her chest. Her hair was pulled over one shoulder now, and she was checking the baby's fingers with slow, careful movements. She looked tired, but stronger than she had last night. "You leave early," she said quietly. "Need food," Dawson answered. "There's game near the creek. Won't be gone long." She studied him for a moment. "You think someone followed you from the wagon?" "They could have," he admitted. "Tracks were old, but raiders don't always move on fast. And if they realized the child wasn't dead, they might come looking." She finished the thought calmly, though her hand tightened slightly on the baby's blanket. Dawson nodded. "That's why I want to look around the ridge. Make sure no one's circling." Nima adjusted the baby, shifting the torn fabric of her dress higher along her shoulder. The neckline remained loose, but she didn't seem embarrassed. Survival had taken priority over modesty a long time ago. Still, when Dawson's gaze flicked down briefly, she caught it and held his eyes, not offended, not angry, just aware. He looked away first, clearing his throat. "I'll keep the fire going," she said, "and stay inside. You hear anything strange, you take cover in the back room. Door sticks, but it holds." She gave a short nod. Dawson stepped outside for real this time, disappearing toward the tree line. Nima watched him go through the cracked doorway, her expression tightening with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months: dependence. She had lived alone long enough to stop expecting help, long enough to assume no one cared whether she lived or died. Yet this quiet cowboy, who barely said more than a few words at a time, had carried a child across frozen land and now checked the forest for threats before he hunted. She shifted the baby in her arms. His eyes fluttered open briefly, soft and unfocused. "You are safer than yesterday," she whispered. "He did that. Not me." The baby settled again. She rose, moving with slow steadiness toward the hearth. She added what Dawson had gathered, fed the fire until the room warmed. Then she checked the cabin, an answer to a question the audience would wonder. What exactly was inside? What resources remained? There were no tools besides a rusted pot and a bent cup. No food, a few torn blankets, broken shelves, and a single small jar of herbs she had collected weeks ago for pain. They had almost nothing. By midday, Nima heard footsteps approaching. They were heavy but controlled, Dawson's gate. She stepped to the door and opened it before he knocked. He stood there with a small rabbit slung over his shoulder and a stiff expression. "Didn't see anything threatening," he said. "Tracks are old. Cabin seems off the main trail." Relief softened Nima's posture. "Good." He stepped inside, set the rabbit down, and crouched near the fire to warm his hands. "Baby wake." "A little," she said. "He is stronger." "That's good," Dawson murmured, voice warm in a way he didn't plan. She watched him skin the rabbit quickly, precise, efficient movements that came from years of doing this alone. "You were a rancher once?" she asked, filling in a gap from last chapter that listeners might wonder about. "Or a trail hand?" "Both," he said quietly. "Family ran cattle near Bitter Mesa. After my brother died, I left. Didn't see a reason to stay. And now, he paused, glancing toward the baby. "Now I got one." Nima looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening. Not pity, not gratitude, something steadier. "He chose you," she said, before he knew anything. Dawson swallowed, the words hitting deeper than he expected. They cooked together, ate slowly, fed the baby again. As evening settled, Dawson patched more of the roof, tightening the hides so the night air wouldn't slice through. Nemo warmed the blankets, humming softly under her breath, a sound that surprised even her. When the fire grew low, Dawson lowered himself beside the hearth. Nemo lay on the opposite side, the baby between them, wrapped securely and breathing full. The night closed around them, the cabin warmer than before, and for the first time since the raiders attacked that wagon, there were no unanswered questions pressing on Dawson's mind. Only the quiet awareness that the three of them were becoming something none of them expected. A small beginning, a fragile calm, but real. The night passed without trouble, and when Dawson woke again, the faint orange light of dawn was pushing through the patched roof. The fire had burned down to a low cluster of red coals, but the cabin held more warmth than it had the day before. Nima was already up, sitting cross-legged beside the baby, her hair falling over one shoulder as she checked his breathing. She didn't look startled to see Dawson awake. Instead, she gave a small, tired nod, the kind shared by two people who had survived another night they weren't sure they would. Dawson stretched the stiffness out of his back, pushing a hand through his hair. He hadn't slept well, but it wasn't fear that kept him half awake this time. It was responsibility. He kept thinking about food, supplies, raiders, winter, and something else he hadn't admitted even to himself yet. He didn't want to leave them, not now that the cabin didn't feel empty anymore. He ate well, Nima said quietly, adjusting the baby's blanket. His color is better. Dawson crouched beside them to get a closer look. The baby's lips weren't as pale, his breathing had a steadier rhythm, and his little fists opened and closed with more strength. Dawson stopped, not used to describing babies. "Better," he finished. Nima watched him with a slight lift of her brow. "You care for him like he is yours." Dawson looked away, jaw shifting. "Doesn't matter whose he is. He deserves a chance." But inside, the question pressed harder than before. Listeners would wonder it too. Could Dawson keep this child? Was he planning to? What would happen if they found the child's family? Those questions lingered in Dawson's thoughts, but he pushed them aside for now. Survival came first. He stood and reached for his coat. "I'm going to check the creek. Might be fish if the water hasn't iced over." Nima rose slightly, one hand braced on the floor. You should not go alone. Dawson paused, surprised. You worried about something? She hesitated, not out of weakness, but because she was choosing her words carefully. I saw movement near the ridge yesterday, before you returned. It was far. Maybe a deer. Maybe not. This was exactly the kind of unresolved detail listeners would question. How safe were they really? And were the raiders still close? Dawson's expression hardened with focus. Tracks. Too far to see from here, she said. But the shadow was tall, not animal. Dawson exhaled slowly, steadying his voice. All right, I'll take a look again. Stay inside. Keep the fire up. She nodded once. Before stepping outside, he glanced back at her and the baby, a brief, protective instinct that had grown stronger with each hour. The air hit colder than yesterday, a thin crust of frost crunching under his boots. Dawson followed the ridge line, scanning the ground. The land was still quiet, but quiet in these parts didn't mean safe. It meant someone could be waiting, listening. As he circled the area where Nima claimed she'd seen movement, he found something half-hidden under brush. A boot print, heavier than his, angled downhill. Not fresh, but not old enough to ignore. He crouched, running his fingers along the edge of the print. One man, maybe two, passing through, or watching. He didn't like either possibility. When he returned, Nima was near the hearth, feeding the baby again. She looked up immediately. You saw something? Footprint, Dawson said, keeping his tone level but firm. Someone's been near the ridge. Not too recent, but close enough we need to be careful. Nima tightened her hold on the baby. Bandits, she murmured, or men looking for trouble. Could be, Dawson said. Could also be someone searching for the people from the wagon. We don't know yet. The unasked question hung between them. Would anyone recognize the baby? Would someone come claiming him? And if they did, would they be friend or enemy? To ease the tension, Dawson knelt by the hearth, pulling the rabbit bones from yesterday out of the pot. I'll make a broth. Might help keep you strong. Nima lifted her eyes. I am fine. You're tired, Dawson said simply. You've been feeding him the whole night. You need more strength than I do. She didn't argue this time. Instead, she watched him with a quiet expression that revealed a small shift in how she saw him. Not as a stranger passing through, but as someone dependable. As the broth simmered, the baby let out a stronger cry, the kind that filled the cabin instead of fading into the cold. Nima lifted him and soothed him with a gentle sway. Dawson watched the scene, the way she cradled the child, the way she whispered to him in soft words he didn't recognize. Her torn dress shifted again as she moved, exposing more of her skin, the curve of her chest, the warmth of her body as she fed him. Dawson looked away briefly, not out of discomfort, but because respect came naturally to him. Still, he felt the pull, the slow, quiet awareness of her beauty, her strength, her closeness. Something forming in the silence between them. After feeding the baby, Nima laid him back on the blanket. What will you do? She asked softly. If someone comes and says he belongs to them. Dawson froze at the question, realizing she had voiced what he had spent all morning avoiding. He swallowed, choosing honesty. If they're decent people, good people, I'd give them back. It'd be the right thing. And if they're not? Her voice held no anger, only concern. Then, Dawson said, jaw tightening, they won't take him. Nima held his gaze, reading the truth in his tone. She didn't challenge it. She didn't doubt it. She simply nodded, a quiet acceptance settling between them. The baby let out a gentle sigh in his sleep, curling his tiny hand toward the fire. Outside, the wind picked up again. Inside, the two adults sat closer than they had the day before. Not a family yet, but something starting, something steady, something neither of them planned and neither of them wanted to lose. The wind carried a sharper bite that afternoon, the sky turning the dull color that came before early snow. Dawson stepped outside to split more wood, but his thoughts stayed anchored inside the cabin, circling the same questions any listener would still wonder. Who were the men near the ridge? Were they tied to the wagon attack? And if they returned, how would he protect both Nima and the child inside a half-ruined shelter? He swung the axe again, the crack of wood breaking the only sound for yards. Each strike came with the same tight focus, measured, controlled, practiced. He wasn't angry, but he was aware. Aware that the peace inside the cabin was thin, temporary, easily broken. When he finally carried the wood back in, he found Nima standing, steadying herself against the wall as the baby slept curled inside the blanket. She had cleaned the corner near the hearth, folded the cloths neatly, and wiped the floorboard with a damp rag she made from melted snow. The place looked more like a home than it had yesterday. "You shouldn't be on your feet so long," Dawson said as he set the wood down. She turned toward him, face calm but tired. "I'm not weak," she replied. "Just careful." He nodded, noticing something else. Her dress had torn slightly more along the side seam when she bent earlier, exposing a line of soft skin along her waist and hip. She didn't seem to mind, but Dawson felt heat in his chest he tried to keep hidden. He turned away briefly, letting the feelings settle before speaking again. "You did all this since morning?" "I needed something to do," she said quietly, smoothing the blanket. "Sitting still makes my mind remember too much." Dawson understood that more than she knew. Keeping busy was how he survived most days. Busy hands left less room for memories. He crouched beside the fire to feed the flames. "If staying busy helps, I can make you a task list. Plenty around here needs fixing." Her lips turned in a faint, brief smile. "Then give me small things. Not heavy work." "We can manage that," he said. A soft coo rose from the blanket. The baby stirred, hungry again. Nima bent to lift him, the movement slow and natural. Dawson's eyes followed without meaning to, drawn by the sight of her holding the infant close to her chest, the torn neckline of her dress slipping slightly as she adjusted him. He forced his gaze upward, to her eyes instead. "You need more food," he said after a moment. "If you're feeding him like that, your body's working harder than mine." Nima kept her attention on the baby, but answered honestly. "Food will help, but strength comes from other things too." "Like what?" Dawson asked. She didn't hesitate. "Safety." The word landed between them with weight. Dawson sat back on his heels. "I'll keep watch tonight. If someone's out there, I'll hear them." "You cannot stay awake all night," Nima said, her tone gentle but firm. "You will fall over by morning." He rubbed his jaw. "Then we take shifts." She looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "You trust me to keep watch?" "I trust you to keep him alive," Dawson answered. "That's enough for me." Her gaze softened, not with emotion she tried to hide, but with something steady and quiet. Respect. They shared a long silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of the baby nursing. After a while, Dawson stood and walked to the door, checking the latch and peering into the dimming woods. The sky had turned darker, and tiny flakes of snow drifted down. "We'll need more protection from the cold," he said. "Roof won't hold if a storm hits." "There is old hide in the back room," Nima offered. "Too stiff for clothing, but maybe useful." "Good," Dawson said. "We'll use it." She watched him work as he dragged the old hide from the back room and hammered it against the largest gap in the roof. His hands were steady, his movements efficient, every action showing a man who had spent years surviving by doing things himself. But now he wasn't working for himself alone. "You fix this place like you plan to stay," Nima said softly. Dawson paused, hammer still in his hand. "I stay until you and the baby have a safe place to go." "And after that?" she asked. He swallowed, because he had no real answer. Not yet, and because another question had begun forming in the back of his mind. One any listener might ask now. Did he want them to leave? Or was he already imagining something more permanent? He lowered the hammer slowly. "After that, we'll see." She held his gaze, reading more in his voice than he intended to reveal. She didn't press further. As evening settled, they shared a small meal and kept the fire strong. The baby slept in the warmest spot between them. Dawson sat with his back to the door, rifle leaning against his knee, eyes alert. Nima watched the baby's tiny chest rise and fall, then looked at Dawson. "If someone comes," she said quietly, "we fight together." Dawson's jaw tightened, not out of fear, but out of the fierce certainty that formed instantly in him. "We do," he said. "No one touches him. No one touches you." The fire crackled, casting soft light over the three of them. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the bond between them deepened, steady, unspoken, and already too strong to break. Snow thickened through the night, coating the land in a pale, uneven layer that muffled sound and made every shadow outside the cabin look heavier. Dawson stayed awake for the first watch, sitting with his back to the door, rifle across his lap, listening to the wind scrape along the roof. He hadn't planned for a storm this early, and listeners might wonder the same thing he did. Could the patch cabin withstand real winter? Could the three of them survive long enough for the baby to fully recover? By the time Nima touched his shoulder for her turn, Dawson's eyes were burning from exhaustion. He didn't argue. He rose slowly, rubbed a hand over his face, and lay down near the blankets. Sleep came quickly, deeper than he intended. When he woke again, the cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Nima sat near the hearth, baby resting in her lap, but her posture was alert, shoulders tense, gaze fixed on the door. Dawson pushed himself upright instantly. "What is it?" he asked, voice low. She didn't turn. "Someone was near," she whispered. "While you slept." His chest tightened. "Footsteps." "No." The snow made it hard to hear. "But I felt it." The shift of air through the cracks. She nodded toward the side window. A shadow passed the glass. Dawson grabbed his coat and rifle. "You should have woken me." "I needed to be sure," she said. "If it was animal or wind, I didn't want to panic you." He stared at her, torn between frustration and respect. "Next time, wake me." Nima's eyes softened slightly. "I will." She had told him about the movement on the ridge before, but now they had confirmation. Someone was watching them, or at least passing dangerously close. The audience would wonder, was it the raiders? A scout? Someone searching for the baby? Dawson didn't have answers yet, but he knew the worst outcome wasn't an attack. It was losing the child or Nima to someone's cruelty or desperation. He crouched by the window and brushed frost away with the back of his hand. The snow outside lay smooth, wind-sculpted, hiding any clear tracks. But something caught his eye, a faint disturbance near the tree line. Not an animal. Too tall. He exhaled sharply. Someone was there. Nima adjusted the baby closer to her chest. Then they know this place is not empty. Dawson stood, tension climbing up his spine. "We need a plan. This cabin isn't strong enough to defend if more than one man comes." "We could leave," Nima said, voice low but steady. "I know small places in the hills, caves the wind does not reach." Dawson shook his head. "Not with a baby this week. Moving in a storm's too dangerous." She didn't argue, but her expression showed the same worry knotting his stomach. Dawson scanned the cabin, checking what he missed earlier. Weak points, broken boards, tools he could use. The questions listeners might ask pressed hard in his mind. Did the raiders leave anything behind at the wagon? Was there something inside the cabin worth taking? Or was someone simply tracking them for the baby? "Nima," Dawson said quietly, "did anyone know you were staying here? Anyone who could have followed you?" Her eyes dropped to the baby. "One man," she admitted, "before I reached this place. He saw me camp near the river. He asked questions. I lied and moved on quickly, but his eyes were wrong." She hesitated, voice tightening. "I prayed he didn't follow." This filled the gap perfectly. Listeners would indeed wonder about Nima's past travels and potential dangers trailing her. Dawson felt his grip tighten around the rifle. If he's the one circling us, he won't like what he finds. Nima watched him with a long, studied look, reading the edge in his voice. "You would fight for a child not yours, and for a woman you barely know." "I'd fight for anyone who doesn't deserve harm," Dawson said. "But for you two?" He paused, breath steady. "There's no question." The fire snapped softly, breaking the silence that followed. He turned his attention back to the door. "We reinforced this place today. Every crack, every corner." Nima nodded. "What do you need?" "Rope, cloth, hides, anything that blocks wind or slows a man from breaking in." She set the baby in the makeshift cradle Dawson had carved earlier, then went to the back room to gather supplies. When she returned, Dawson noticed how she moved, closer to him, more aligned with his steps, as if they had begun sharing the same instinct for danger. They worked side by side for hours. Dawson hammered loose boards back into place. Nima stitched torn hide with steady fingers, sealing gaps in the walls. They piled logs near the door to slow entry and hung a thick blanket across the window. As they worked, Dawson caught glimpses of her. The curve of her shoulder as she bent, the torn neckline revealing the soft rise of her chest when she lifted the hide, the small sound she made when her fingers pricked on a splinter. He forced himself to stay focused, but the awareness lingered, quiet and undeniable. When they finally paused to eat, the storm outside had darkened the sky further. Snow gathered thick along the doorway. Nima settled beside the baby, feeding him again. Dawson watched her, feeling something stronger forming inside him than simple protectiveness. She looked up, eyes meeting his. "He is stronger because of you," she said. Dawson shook his head. "Because of us." Her gaze held as a moment longer, warm despite the fear outside. Then the wind howled, pushing hard against the side of the cabin. They both turned their heads at the same time, listening, waiting, knowing the next night wouldn't be simple, and that whoever was out there was getting closer. The storm grew heavier as night settled, the wind pushing hard against the patched walls, making the hides Dawson had nailed tremble with each gust. The cabin held steady, warmer, sealed, safer, but tension sat thick in the room. Dawson kept his rifle near his knee, his shoulders stiff, every sound outside pulling at instincts sharpened by years of travel and trouble. Nima stayed close to the hearth, rocking the baby gently, her eyes moving to the door every time the wind changed. She didn't speak much, but Dawson watched the way she breathed, slow, controlled, prepared. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid for the child. After some time, she looked at him, her voice quiet but firm. "You think the man I saw is the same who hurt the wagon?" Dawson had asked himself that all day. The listeners would wonder too. Could be, he said, or someone who saw the aftermath. Raiders talk. They trade information. If he follows the trail here, she didn't finish the sentence. Dawson didn't need her to. Then we deal with him. She lowered her eyes to the baby. Why would a man hunt a child who cannot fight back? Dawson answered only after a long pause. Because some men see weakness as profit. It wasn't what she wanted to hear, but it was the truth of the frontier. The baby stirred, making a soft sound. Dawson's gaze followed instantly, an instinct he didn't try to hide. Nima noticed, and something softened in her expression. Not surprise, not fear, something warmer. She shifted the infant and fed him again, her torn neckline falling open a little more under the movement. Dawson tried to look only at the fire, but the image of her holding the child, strong, gentle, beautiful, pulled at him in ways he didn't voice. He forced himself to focus on the danger outside. "I'll check the window." He moved toward the side wall, brushing frost away with the edge of his sleeve. Snow had piled high, blocking most of the view, but movement caught his eye, a faint shape, low to the ground, slipping between trees. He stepped back, pulse tightening. Someone's out there. Nima straightened immediately. The same shape as before. "Can't be sure," Dawson muttered. "But he's watching the cabin." The next question formed fast, the one any listener would be asking. If someone was stalking them, why hadn't they attacked yet? "Maybe he's alone," Dawson said, thinking aloud. "Maybe he's waiting for the storm to weaken, or he wants to see who else is inside. Or he fears you," Nima said. "Some men wait until a man sleeps before they strike." Dawson's jaw tightened. Then he'll be disappointed. He dragged the crates Nima had found earlier toward the door, stacking them as a secondary barrier. Nima moved to help, but Dawson stopped her gently. "Stay with him," he said, nodding toward the baby. Her hands stilled, and she obeyed. Dawson worked for the next hour, reinforcing the doorframe, preparing firing angles at the window, checking the rifle. Nima watched his movements, noticing something she hadn't asked earlier, something the audience might wonder too. "You handle that rifle like you have seen more fights than you say." Dawson paused. His voice stayed low. "I've survived things I don't talk about." She waited, expecting more. He exhaled. "I ran with a small outfit once. Men who took justice into their own hands. We hunted raiders and killers. My brother came with me,